Swinburne University of Technology.
I'm talking today with Professor Kurt Seemann for the PhD Hub. I'm Professor Josie Arnold, and we're talking about his work, which is absolutely fascinating. Kurt's research focus is the relationship between people, technology, and the environment as a complex way of relating these three quite difficult concepts in design. So we live in a designed world. Often we don't even notice the designed world in which we live, or we're not very good at it, but Kurt is particularly good at it. So today we're talking about how he began his work in this very interesting area of community design. So Kurt, how did you start off in this?
Oh, thank you, Josie. I was introduced to this area in my undergraduate years, where we studied culture and technology, but we were trained in the technical fields. So I was starting to see that we embed ourselves in the things we make around us. And more so, when we experience things made by others, we're not necessarily picking up on the assumptions behind the social dimension of the use or management of these things that people make.
Right, right.
My first project was over in the Solomon Islands, and I was working on what was called a micro hydroelectric scheme. And the significance of this scheme was a small village level dam that they cut from the trees up on the mountain to create a little hydro power project to give a light, so that light could shine on the morning market garden, so they could collect it in the early hours of the morning and take it across.
Well, it was still very fresh.
Well, it was still very fresh, because that was a significant community development advantage, to bring your produce to the market while it was still quite fresh and not affected by the sun, being in the tropics. And so the problem is most technologies that produce electricity require a lot of sophisticated money or equipment or skills to keep them going. So the question that popped up was, how do we engage a different culture into imagining a technology that produces light that they can maintain endlessly when people like us leave?
Right. And so this is the idea that we live in a built environment, in a designed environment, but rather than the macro design of the big cities and the big power grids, you're looking at how a small community can really utilise that design.
Yeah, and vice versa. What happens is that we often transfer in aid projects, when one country donates aid to another country, we transfer systems of technologies that assume behaviour and organisational structure to keep them going, and they devastate the receiving beneficiary community, because they demand a cash flow that doesn't exist,
right,
or they demand a social organisation change to keep them that wasn't there in the structure of the community. And so the made world we create not only helps build our understanding of reality around us, but when a reality is forced upon us through made things into our lives, it can have a fairly negative effect, if not designed well, for people's cultures.
So the important thing is this interaction between the people, the technology, the design and the use of it.
Yes.
And its relevance to the community well-being.
Yes. And so that launched me into a program to look at how remote, traditional Aboriginal communities in the desert northern regions of Australia were responding to a rather rapid transfer of mainstream technical services and designed houses and washing machines and toilets and things like that. And that was where my PhD was based, in some very remote communities. In fact, there was a community I spent a lot of time in, and known as Kintur or Warranguru, and that's near the Western Australian Northern Territory border. And in 1985, a mob came in from the WA side, which was only 48 kilometres away, and had first contact.
That's right. I've seen videos of these people.
So in 1986 I started my PhD there to understand how they were going to interact with all this new systems of housing and development.
So a PhD project arose from you from the ability to see that a community needs to be able to relate to the technology that will privilege them or may not.
That's right. And look, what's underneath all this is layers of interaction. So you've got the human cognitive physiological layer of interaction, you know, us with clothing, us with table. But you also have the sociological interaction, us as a group managing this table, us
Yes.
as a group. And then you have the a fairly bigger community level of interaction where you have organisational structures, belief systems that can guide how you respond to bigger issues coming into your community. And so these layers aren't very well understood, often because the disciplines are so focused. An engineer will look at the technical things and dismiss the social dimension. And vice versa, a social scientist can often underestimate the significance of the technical dimension when they look at the impact on people.
And so this is where design comes in,
Yes.
because it's looking at all of those elements.
Yeah, well look, there's one of the things that design, everyone designs. It's like everyone understands ideas of discovery in science. Everyone understands basic ideas, you know, everyone is a scientist, everyone's a designer. Being rigorously good at that is the key. So there are some principles and patterns to get to know about how people interact with the world that they make and how they interact with the world made by others.
Right.
And then to realise that what I would refer to as the thesis of the agent, of us, and the thesis of the thing made, neither can exist without ecology. So it's pretty hard to study the made world without also including a question about the source of its existence, that's ecology. And it's hard to understand us without understanding that we rely on the things we make, which also have our dependency on ecology. So to study the transfer of design and technology across cultures, it really requires you to get to know this idea that people, our ecological resource context, and the things we make rely on each other. And so you have to see it as a symbiotic system rather than any object on its own.
Yes, yes. So it has strong elements of ethnographic studies?
Yes, yes. In fact, the area that I specialised in at University of New South Wales was called ethnotechnology.
Right.
For that reason.
Yes.
And later became industrial archaeology before I graduated. And the key there is to be technically knowledgeable as well as socially trained. You know, they're pretty big degrees, usually 5-year degrees.
Yes.
And they demand this insight into the constraints of the social and the cognitive dimension of things, and also understanding the possibilities to affect real impact. Because one of the things that designers and everyone who engages in the act of designing wants to do is actually create something and produce something. So there's a desire to make it actually work, and so the transfer of technology and design becomes a really big issue when it comes to community development aspirations, because if you put in the wrong technology you create more problems than you solve.
So you're saying this is a two-way street, I think, and so I'm thinking in terms of distant Indigenous communities that you have mentioned. So there's strong ethical questions here about imposing European, Euro-Western style of advanced, so-called advanced technologies and designs upon people who have their own very strong knowledge systems, design systems, insight systems. How did you deal with that?
Well, it is a two-way street, probably a multi-way street.
Yes.
It's a two-way street because the first part, I think people understand that when you... here's a great example of how the one-way, the donor to the receiver process,
Yes.
can affect a community. A great case study in the northern regions of Queensland was where often the early settlement from white into Aboriginal communities was the church. That was a main arm of government, that the church went out and created a platform to, if you like, socialise people into...
Through the mission system.
Through the mission system.
Which drew people into the land around the mission church.
Yes, but one of the things at this example is that in this particular case, the missioner couldn't attract people to attend the church. What he didn't understand, of course, was that they had their own belief system. They didn't need another one.
That's right.
But to entice people to come, he put a big box of steel handheld axes out the front of the church, and that if you came to church, you could have one, right? Very prized option, the axe. But the trouble was, the effect of that was devastating on that community. Every year, the trade lines from this area of the northern parts of Cape York of Queensland would go right across through to the middle of Queensland and down into the deserts towards the Diamantina area, where the other tribes would trade back up the line. This whole trade line had, among other things, marrying off, but it also had trading objects that you couldn't get in one region, but you could in the other. So one of the things that you could get really well up in the tropics area, where there was a lot of water and rivers, were prized smooth stones, and stones which were great for being the adze on the end of it. On the other hand, really good hardwood would come from the more arid areas, and so they were traded. So the axe would be born. Yes, so the axe would be born, and so the best of both materials were traded. The difficulty with this is that in the case of the axe, because there were tools that women used, but in the case of the axe, that was a men's tool, right? And so the men had a social role to lead the negotiation of the trade. Now, the other thing is, because of that, it was part of a ceremonial growing up. You know, trading these tools was becoming an older man. Suddenly, the church was providing a steel axe, and the steel axe was picked up by young women, by young boys who haven't gone through initiation. All of a sudden, everybody had an axe, and this tension of, hang on, that's my role as a male in the social structure to trade these axes. Now, what are we doing? You know, and the consequences were even worse, because once the axe got blunt, you needed a file, because the stones could be sharpened. That's right. By other means, and you needed a file. So to have a file then meant you needed cash, because you couldn't just pick up a file in the bush and shape it. You actually needed to buy one. So cash economy became a bit more of a pressure item. These objects that were introduced to this culture and were essentially necessary moved from an axe tool that was rather sustainable socially and ecologically to a tool that was not sustainable. They couldn't socially and ecologically sustain it. They had to now buy into the cash economy, and that meant buying into the rules on how you work to get money. Yes. And all of a sudden, tools and technologies became a pretty good way of socialising people into another system. And that's a very good example of a one-way street, isn't it? Yeah. Nobody says to the Indigenous people, what have you got? Yeah, so what we don't do, and this is one of the questions in cross-cultural design technology transfer studies, is do we put the warning sign on the packet? You know, when we are the donor to the receiver process, the creator designer to another culture, are we saying, look, this stuff works, but be aware, here are the things that you're going to have to be working through if you want this stuff, because we have to do it to work it through. So are we aware as donors of all the social, political and economic dimensions and environmental dimensions, the people, technology, environment systems, of everything we create when we teach people other technical processes or when we transfer devices and systems to them? Do we put the warning on the packet to say, be aware, this will affect your social system?
And so that's a very integrative way of looking at design, isn't it?
Yes.
So you're not just saying, look, I've got a terrific axe.
Yes.
You're saying, I've got a terrific axe, but the implications of using this axe go on in your culture in this way.
Yes.
And so we need to negotiate whether you need this axe.
Yes. Now the other way is also...
this axe.
That's right.
And then we don't ask the other question, or do you ask the other question, could we use your axe? I mean, I'm using that axe as you have as a metaphor.
Yes, that's right.
Obviously.
Well, let's move on to a washing machine, which is another object I've been involved in designing and studying. It sounds fairly mundane, a washing machine.
Not to me. Not to any mother.
But this became a real big employment program when I was working in Central Australia to design and build these hand-powered washing machines.
Yes.
The brief came to us from two Aboriginal women. One group from Papunya, which is anyone who studies Indigenous Australia would know Papunya is a significant assimilation strategy location in its years, and also a nearby community called Mount Liebig.
Yes.
And two women's groups came and said, one of them said, we need a petrol-powered washing machine. And the other brief was, not at the same time, but around the same time, was, can you recommend a washing machine that can wash blankets?
Right.
So typically what often design people can end up doing is, then go into a brainstorm session and figure out all sorts of crazy ways we can come up with amazing, beautiful washing machines that are petrol powered, and the engineers would be excited about that, and then you'd have someone making it big enough to wash a blanket. But there's another approach that says, why do you think that's the solution?
Yes.
Right.
So you sit outside the given problem.
Yes.
And you say, this is the problem as it's been given to me, or to the project person, or to the PhD student, or whatever. But I don't have to be confined by the dimensions of that problem as it's given to me.
No, because often people come to you when there's a material concern in their life that expresses understandably what it is they know.
That's right.
And your role as a researcher in design and technology is to see what that knowledge position is and why they think that's the solution. It might be the solution,
yes,
but just to check.
That's right.
So we went out, and what we did was, in this case, it was what we call a needs analysis approach, where we observe, we look expressed need, felt need. These are different kinds of needs you can match to methods. And what we were really finding out in the end was that when we were watching women wash, because it was a women's thing in this particular culture, and they had their children with them, it was quite a strong social belonging moment, right? And the difficulty is that the heritage of the washing machine, we was introduced, had an association with a petrol power generation. So you bought your electric, Simpson type washing machine, and you would extend a whole heap of extension cords over to where the portable generator was, because it was too heavy to drag over. The petrol engine was associated quickly, was associated quickly as a men's technology.
Yes.
And the washing machine as a women's technology. And the real reason why they wanted a petrol-powered washing machine wasn't because they didn't have electricity, was because in this particular set of communities, men were really big on using the portable generator to power their country music bands. and
They
run.
didn't want it used up in a washing machine.
They didn't mind it being used for washing machine. It's just that when they wanted it was never available. Right? So the women thought, well, if we put that machine inside the washing machine,
Yes.
the generator inside the washing machine, make it a petrol-powered washing machine, then they would control
Yes.
the technology. So that was the
So
basis.
you're coming to community beliefs and
Yes.
practices and gender-driven ideals and ideas.
That's right. And so then what happened was, what was about this thing about the blankets? Now the blankets became a really important thing. The blankets was all about the main item of clothing. If you look at your weekly cycle and you look at the things you wash, you know, probably the heaviest thing you'd put in might be a towel. Everything else is thin cotton, it's sheets, it's those sorts of things. But if you try and put in a full laden blanket, often with sand and everything going through it, and you try and put it in any washing machine you have at home, even your big 8-kilo washing machines, it just sits there and doesn't do anything. So our washing machines that we have in urban mainstream life aren't expecting you to put a blanket in it. But in the remote communities, the blanket is everything. It's got highest priority as a fabric over your clothing.
Yes.
So the blanket is where you lay it out on the ground to have everybody get together, to have a meal, to have the kids there, to have the dogs there. It's the blanket you use to pad yourself in the back of a car on a long drive. It's what you need to keep warm because it gets icy cold in the deserts.
That's right.
But the blankets quickly then accumulate not only dirt, but a lot of food grime, organic material, and parasites from dogs and so on. So they need to be washed. So what we were really coming down to was rethinking the cross-cultural brief in design, and talked about these observations with these women's groups and saying, is it what you're really asking for is to have a device that washes blankets, is independent of men, and is not going to interrupt you having conversations with everybody with your kids around you, because they're noisy if you put a petrol engine inside. So that changed the brief, and we always had a philosophy in the group that I worked with that anything we designed should create employment.
Right.
So we designed it so that people could make it, and we had an Aboriginal enterprise manufacturing design technology workshop, and they would produce the things we researched and designed. And we came up with a plunger-oriented hand-powered washing machine which would wash a heavy laden blanket in about 3 minutes.
Fantastic.
Right. So, and it was easy to move around. It didn't have any electrical or powered device. It was just the weight of your arm would do it, because the spring would pull it up and you just use your weight of your arm to keep the suction effect. And it was effective because it was sucking up and down rather than spinning or agitating.
Yes.
And we just used 44-gallon drums and reconverted them and put rims on them and a few other things. So that became a really successful project. There's a dimension to these sorts of issues where when you design things across culture, the effect of the mainstream media on the receiving culture of what is good is also a reverse problem, because in the same thematic context where these two women's groups were expressing what they thought was the ideal solution, that theme where people think what is the ideal solution is heavily influenced by the modelling in the media of what the solutions are.
And that's where the designer imposes or puts themselves in that space of possibility.
Yes.
Rather than the givens of the media or
Yes.
of the desire of the client, if you like.
Yes, and in this case, it's one of the difficult things in a equity context in design, an ethical equity context, is this ethical dilemma of if a community is desiring a solution which your research is saying is going to have a negative effect, but they insist on it, and it's not just one or two people being affected, it can have a transitional change, where is the line where you say, well, okay, we shouldn't really be doing this, even though they want it because they see that as the image.
But we can see this, I mean, it's probably fairly clear when you're talking about an Indigenous community and design. But of course it's clear if you're over-designing, over-housing in an environment in the city too, isn't it?
It is,
so it's not just a problem of people who are not in the Euro-Western traditions.
That's right. In fact, this is what makes a really good PhD in design, because the reason why I wanted to talk about that more cultural and geographic economic contrast is that it's easy to see. It's
very clear,
it's very clear.
Yes.
But the issue, you're absolutely right, the issue remains constant throughout any interaction.
For example, we're now talking about vertical gardens on big buildings in the city so as to simulate gardens and environments that aren't city-bound but could become. So that's another example of design, isn't it? Is
yes.
Looking at something that is and seeing how it can become something else.
That's right, and fundamentally there's a role where we have to, as design researchers, reveal the invisible systems behind the choices people are making. Like,
yes.
If you want the in this case the washing machine or other projects where we've made toilets and houses, if you want these things to look the way you see on a popular sitcom or TV program, be aware, warning on the packet.
All the implications.
All the implications, like a flush toilet system in the desert means that you can't have more than about 5 people using your house because they're not designed to handle more than that.
Yes.
You're going to have a plumber accessible because they will block. And that means you have to have a licensed plumber in the Australian system. That means in the remote communities you're not going to support a salary of a plumber because you'll also need an electrician and a builder, and there isn't the economy to do that.
So you're always thinking outside the square in this situation.
Yeah, always look at the consequential, logical other systems that are needed to keep that device going. And if you think of the world like that, whether it's I'm designing for you or you for me, and if I'm the designer, my responsibility to you is to let you know what are the systemic demands on this solution we're creating together, right? It's not just the thing.
Yes.
It's once it's in your life, it's changed your life, right? We design because we actually want to change people's lives. Otherwise, what's the point? You know, it's just an inert thing hanging around somewhere that we're not even engaging with. So the fact that once we've created something in the world that didn't exist before, the world is now different and it's responding to it differently. So over time, anything we've created becomes a question of relevance. Do we still have it this way? Should we change it?
And can we change it? I mean, for example, you've mentioned toilets. We're already talking about the flush system in city toilets and whether that can be changed. People have talked about vacuum flushes and people can't cope with the idea that it might be like an aeroplane toilet.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's a very basic design question that you've talked about the desert people, but it's so right within the most sophisticated city systems, isn't it?
That's right. And look, every technology and system, service, graphic or object design, once it's created, it engages with the systems around it. Therefore, the first time you create it, I mean, the more informed position would be to have it fit well into the system that it has to work in. So a hand-powered washing machine might not be the ideal for a high-rise urban person.
That's right.
Right. But it might be the ideal for a remote rural area.
That's right. And so, indeed it has been. Yeah.
But the same thing goes for many other things. When we were designing technology training courses, the things that people needed to live happy, fulfilling lives in the desert were skill sets that were mixing, blending traditional with introduced to make life worthwhile and express their ideas out there. But unfortunately, our training standard systems in Australia start from the position that your qualification is only relevant if you could use it on the coast.
Yes, right.
But the coastal qualifications, the plumber wouldn't know how to manage some of the toilet designs that needed to work out bush. They're not qualified for it, and vice versa. In a sense, the context is a real big factor when you begin design research. It's a critical thing. So you have to really look at, you know, the key systems of people, technology, environment at least, behind anything you're about to design. What's the context factors of people? What's the context factors of other systems that it needs? What's the context factors of the ecology environment that it's interacting with? And that will build up the brief.
Well, Kurt, you've certainly convinced me about the importance of design brief, the community interactions with the technology and the design, and the numerous PhDs and postgraduate studies to which this must lead. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
This has been a Swinburne production.